So having looked at a bit of the theology of work and looking through what the Bible has to say over what work is, we're now going to look at a bit more what that looks like for us in terms of our journey with Jesus, and we're going to look at what I call vocation. Vocation might be a word that you don't really know what it means. When I use the term vocation, I'm not so much talking about a particular job description like nurse or fireman or baker. Like when I use the term vocation, what I'm talking about is, we've looked at in the last session about work being this gift that God had given humanity, that we were supposed to take the raw potential of earth somewhere, like we're supposed to be creative and make something of it, and that's a vocation given to humanity as a whole. But actually, we're each individually made in the image of God with particular gifts and passions, and I believe that God has made each of us with a personal vocation, something that we have been individually made to bring within creation, and that we each have a part to play, and that jobs and kind of like what we put our effort into isn't just an arbitrary thing, and that all work is good, and that as long as I put my effort to something, that is good in itself. Like, I feel that although it's hard to kind of discern this and figure it out, actually we all are called by God to invest in a very particular type of role to play in His kingdom. And I'd love to explore this with you. I'd really recommend, I know I've mentioned it a few times already, but the book Garden City by John Mark Comer. He has a whole sort of chapter looking at vocation, and has a series of questions, 7 questions, that basically help you unpick what your vocation is, like what it is that God has called you for and to put your energy towards. And I really recommend reading that chapter and looking through and really reflecting on that. But we're going to cover a few of those in this session, and I just want to make it really clear when I'm talking about vocation and how we're figuring this out. I'm not talking about like how to figure out what job to do after uni. Like, it's not like specific as to how it looks. It's wider than that. It's broader than that. And I think when you're at the end of uni, you're the end of that educational conveyor belt, and you kind of feel this pressure to be like, I need to figure out like the next thing, the next job. And what I kind of want you to do is to maybe just, whilst that kind of next step is important, spend a bit of your time in your final year just kind of zooming out a little bit, and just thinking through, okay, what is the broader aspect that God is calling me into in His kingdom? Because I know for me, I finished uni and I went straight into a job, and I just, I went straight into focusing on like what the roles were and how to get better at it. And it wasn't until a few years into the job that I started being more reflective and thinking like, actually, why am I doing this, and what am I called for, and is this what God has for me? Like, and how does this architecture work that I do relate to kind of the passions that I have for church, and like, how do I balance that? Like, there's a whole series of questions there that I'm currently journeying through now. And the earlier you start this, the better. And it's not that we're going to come up with the answer to what your vocation is now or this week. This is something that is going to be ongoing for you in your life. But I'd encourage you to be really intentional with it. So there's 3 key questions to your vocation. We're going to look at 2 of them. So the vocation questions are what, who, and how. And the most easy to understand is the how, because that's the kind of practical side of it. The how is like, what does my vocation look like in day-to-day practice? Like, does this mean a paid salaried job in this particular role, or is it a kind of heading up a charity? Is it starting a side business? Like, it's very much the how is the kind of, the practical outworking. We're not going to look at that in this session. What I want to look at is the 2 first ones, the what and the who of your vocation. And by the word what, I mean, what is the underlying motivating drivers for you in what you do? What is it that brings you life, and that when you devote your energy to is both life-giving for you but also for others, and is basically a part of how God has wired you and made you what He's made you for? And I'll try and give some examples. Often your what, in terms of what you're made for, and it's not just like one particular thing, it can be a few, but they're often ing words, so words that end in ing, and they're very they can be quite broad. Like, we're not talking about specific job roles here. We're talking about quite broad aspects of your life and things that you do. So I'm just going to give a whole bunch of examples here. So they could be words like teaching, inspiring, innovating, liberating, challenging, reconciling, creating, building, calculating, changing, persuading. Like, there could be loads more. And they are, as I say, they're quite like broad sort of foundational bases that are, it's how you're wired. It will make what makes you tick, and they could be outworked in your life in many different ways. And I found this really helpful to think through, because often when you're at the end of uni, you're thinking through like, oh, what's the specific job that you want, and is that the right thing? And thinking through the what of your vocation is a really helpful lens through which to consider whether this is something I should or shouldn't pursue. And it's not something I was necessarily aware of. I went into architecture after uni, got a job as an architect, and it's only been in the last kind of couple of years that I've really started to discern that what my what is, and there's a few, but my two key ones are learning and teaching. And I've sort of figured out, like, so the first one, learning, like I've gone into architecture and I was asking, like, why have I gone into this? Why has this been always like a key driver for me? And the learning side of it is key. Like, being an architect, you're very much you're leading a team of specialists, whether that's engineers or conservators or planners. Like, there's many other disciplines that you're kind of helping manage and coordinate. And you as the architect just have a lot to learn, and most architects don't come in, they don't really know what they're doing until their 40s or 50s. Like, it takes a long time to learn the kind of knowledge and the expertise, and that's one of the aspects that I love. Like, I'm sure there's loads of other job roles that I could do where you still have to learn things. Like any job, you have to learn things, but architecture is a particular job where there's just so much knowledge that you take years and decades to sort of build up in order to be able to do your role well. And it's just so broad, and that's what brings me life. Like, I love the fact that every week in work there's just so much for me to gain knowledge-wise in order to do my job well, and that I can build on that over years. This is something that I'm building up over time, learning the kind of architectural role and other roles as well in order to do what I do well, and I love that. Similarly with the teaching, like, this teaching is probably one that I knew really early on, even when I was at school, that I was passionate about. And when I chose to study architecture, I thought, oh well, I'm putting teaching to the side. I guess I'm not going to do that, because I thought, well, if teaching is a passion, then I should become a teacher. But actually, I've realised that even though I now do my job as an architect and then volunteer for church doing student stuff, I have so many outflows for my teaching passion, whether that's tutoring with universities through architecture, whether it's doing things like this to camera, whether it's doing kids work. Like, there's so many avenues for me to have that teaching gift, to use that teaching gift. And for me, I've realised that maybe I won't do my architecture job forever. Maybe I won't do my current role with church forever. Like, the how is very much going to change in my future, but those two aspects of learning and teaching are two key things that are a lens for me through which I'm going to make decisions over what I go into and what I say yes to and what I say no to. So that's been really helpful for me. That is a core part of the what that God has made me about, that I need to focus on. So I'd encourage you to spend some time on that. It doesn't necessarily need to be a word that ends in ing. It can be other things, but often it will be an ing type word, and it's probably not going to be the same as me. Maybe for you, innovating is the key thing. Like, whenever you kind of create new things, that's the thing that gives you passion. Or inspiring, maybe you just know that when you've done, I don't know, youth work camps in the past, that inspiring someone for something, like, it's giving you a real passion. But maybe you're not going to do that in a youth context. Maybe there's another area where you're still doing the inspiring, so it's in a different context, but inspiring is still a key part of it, and that's what you're about. So have some time thinking through what that is. And then the second part is the who. So that we've done the what, and now we're going to look at the who. And often when you're thinking through, like, oh, what job am I going to do, what I'm going to put my energy to, often that can be a very kind of self-focused way of thinking about it. Like, what job do I need to do to be happy and to feel successful? What kind of job do I need to do in order to have financial stability? What will I don't know, gain, whatever. Like, it's very much focused on, like, how does these jobs and roles apply to me in my life, like how will I feel about it? But I feel that as followers of Jesus, like a key part of that vocation in Genesis 1, to go and fill the earth and to create community and to make things, like that is in order to bless the world. Like there's this aspect that our work has to be outward focused, and I think for us as followers of Jesus, we need to think through like who are the people that God is calling us to. And you might think of like traditional missionaries that are called to a particular people group far away, and that those are people that are very much people or who driven Christians. Actually, I think this applies to all of us. We shouldn't just be thinking about like what is it for me that needs work that brings me satisfaction and purpose. We need to think through like who are the people that God has chosen me to bless, to protect, to help, whether that's a age group, whether that's a geographical group, economic group, racial group, whatever it is. Like who are the people that God is calling me to? And that might change over time, but often God will have placed on your heart a particular group, and if he hasn't, if you don't feel that's there, spend some time just praying and asking God, like, who are the people that when I come alongside them and help them, it brings me life? Or who, when I see things in the news, whatever, who are the people that issue, that people group, it just breaks my heart? And just bring that before God, spend some time reflecting that through with him. And as I say, the how of what that looks like can be a whole range of things, and I'd love to talk about that in our group discussions, but the what and the who, I'd say those would be some great things to reflect with Jesus on this week. And I was going to end with a few helpful pointers, as these are a bit more sort of random, shorter bits of advice. So the first one is we live in a you can do anything culture. We live in a culture that says that as long as you put your mind to something and you try really hard, you can achieve it. And that can almost be, I know for many students that I've spoken to, almost like a culture that paralyzes you, because there's almost so many options, so many things you could do, that it almost becomes like, well, what could I do? And you kind of get this like fear of trying anything, or like fear of failure like becomes huge. And what I'd say is that in some ways, like I'd agree with that stance of like you can do anything and that God's given you so much potential. Don't limit yourself. Aim high and just be courageous in what you do. But at the same time, I've learned that in order to reach my potential, I need to embrace my limitations and embrace the fact that God hasn't wired me the same as most of the people that I was at uni with, and that for me, living out my vocation means knowing that there's certain limitations God has put on me, and that I shouldn't just fight against those and try and make myself more this or more that. Actually, I'm okay in the lane that I'm in. Like God's put me on a lane, something that he wants me to do, and I'm going to do that. And maybe it doesn't look as successful as that, or maybe it doesn't make as much money as that person, or maybe it doesn't reach as wide as an audience. But that's okay. Like this is the lane that God's put me in, and accepting those limitations is a good thing. Secondly, I think in the John Mark Comer book, if you read it, he talks about figuring out your vocation through the gifts that God's given you. Like what are the natural things that you are good at or passionate about that are an indication of what your vocation might be. And I totally agree that we should focus on, we should use that as a tool for figuring out how God's wired us. But I'd also say, don't limit the call of God on your life based on what you're good at or qualified at. When you read the Bible, you'll just come across character after character after character who God asks them to do precisely the thing that they are most unqualified to do, because he knows that if he asks them to do it, they're going to have to trust him for it. Like if he asks the person who's good at it, they'll probably just do it in their own strength, whereas he often calls, whether that's Moses, who thinks that he can't speak to anyone, God's calling him to go to Egypt and speak to everyone. Like he calls people that are going to have to rely on him to do what he's called them to do. So when you're like, figuring things out and you feel like you have a passion for something, but you're like, I just don't have the qualifications, I don't have what's required for it. Don't let that limit what God might be calling you to, and actually it might be precisely because you feel underqualified for it that God is calling you into it. Thirdly, I just want to release any kind of pressure that some of you may feel when you know that other people have a very specific calling and that they know exactly what it is. What I'd say is that some people are given a very specific vocation and calling in their life, but other people are given much broader and wider, and that there's not like a, well, one is better than the other. Actually, I think we need both, and that maybe your ing word, your what word, is just so broad that it'll look so different in different stages of your life, and that God needs that. That's part of what the community of God needs, is people that can be really flexible in the way their vocation applies in different areas of their life. So I think there is importance in being intentional in what God's called you to, and saying no to other things. Like, I've had to learn to do that, to say no to things that I know aren't my core things. So I've tried to like streamline what I focus on. But at the same time, your calling may be broader than others, and that's okay. And then finally, I just want to really encourage you to try and be reflective on this. Like, I know I'm very task driven, and when I was at uni and first few years of work, like I didn't often stop and reflect on, like, why am I doing this? What's God calling me to? How do I need to be intentional over the next few years to really focus in on things? Like, I just wasn't very reflective, and I just encourage you, just use the tools that are available to you. Speak to other people about this. Use personality tests, like things like 16 characters, Myers-Briggs. There's loads of others. Only use them as tools. Don't use them as prescriptive things, but just use things that help you reflect on how you're wired, and don't just use that in a kind of tick box exercise kind of way that, it comes out at the end as saying I'm this or that. Use that in a reflective way with God, like pray through it, invite him into that conversation, and ask for him to speak to you through that, to figure out more of how he's wired you. I'd love to speak to you more about this, so do touch base with me. I love having these conversations, so look forward to speaking with you soon.